What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things, a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters, small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful. Just down on his luck, she didn't press charges. Instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending. My mom was driving, and a guy ran out in the road. So she stopped, so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason. Purely wrong place, wrong time. According to Japanese sources, and unimaginably raped and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a D agent in Mexico, who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos, Mexico. But from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kellyanne Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing, and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends degraded, tortured, and killed over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and raped her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other. You could list them all day. Sylvia Likens, I got sick just reading the name again. I was thinking of adding it here, but couldn't remember the last name. It was almost a relief after decades of this story sticking with me, and there was no way I could make myself go and look it up. Read it here and instantly I'm sick. They mutilated that poor girl. They used her sister as a coercive threat. The carriage driver not only encouraged her own children to torture Sylvia, but the neighborhood kids also came around and participated. Cops came to the house even. But the lack of punishment. The fact every participant paroled out and went on to become school teachers and ministers. I needed to make sure I had something right, and here is a basic wiki link. It doesn't go too much into the horrible details compared to other references, but I'm now going to crawl in a hole for the next few weeks. Stick to r/aww for a while. Have a drink and enter recovery. Link. Wikipedia. org/wiki/murder_of_Sylvia_Likens. Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house, only to be shot by the homie Arwana. The homie Arwana saw a bloody long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery. Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said just as he started to step out onto the trail, he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips, as if to tell him to be silent, and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later, he said the lead element of a group of NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70-80 soldiers equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed, and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black/half Creek freeman who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle. A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university in the city town 25-ish miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe had driven. At some point she split off to play cornhole or something and was later inexplicably gone. Phone calls went to voicemail. Police were called, but she was simply missing. About 10 days later she was found by a homeless man who witnessed her crawling up to a bus stop in the city, begging for help. She had broken a leg and an arm, and was in very bad shape. At the quite large party, she had her drink secretly drugged, and was then led off by a group of men into their vehicle. She was taken to an apartment where she was drugged, repeatedly raped, and locked in a small room in between with a bucket to use as a bathroom. At one point, after being injected with heroin and raped, she somehow managed to convince one of her captors to allow her to use the actual bathroom to clean herself up. This bathroom had a small window to the outside, and with the shower running, she managed to squeeze out and fell from the 3rd story into a large hedge/bush. From there she crawled from the apartment complex to the road and bus stop, where the homeless man saw her and called police. Many cars stopped upon seeing her, making her captives unable to recapture her. 3 men were later arrested for the crime after surveillance cameras allowed police to locate the apartment which she jumped from. She returned to our university almost 2 years later, graduated, and became a nurse. She was obviously traumatized, never partied again, carried a gun everywhere she could, and somehow moved on with life. It was a terrifying tale none of us ever forgot. She was an 18-year-old freshman when the incident happened. Ed Kemper murdered college women because his mother worked at a college, and he claims he wanted to destroy everything she loved. Then, he murdered his mother and decapitated her, raped her head and her body, set her head on a shelf, and screamed at it for hours. That is the part that terrifies me. Close bracket. Then he murdered her best friend and turned himself in, relaying the whole story in detail, crying, "Edit, it hurts because I'm not a lizard. I didn't crawl out from under a rock. I came from my mother's vagina, and in a rage, I went right back in." Ed Kemper quote from a police interview. Link. Oxygen.com/Kemper on Kemper inside the mind of a serial killer/crime time/Ed Kemper mother murder. Freaks me the hell out. Edit 111 days later. I'm still getting comments on this, so I'll add another thing that makes him creepy. He would bury the heads of the women he killed in his mother's backyard. He lived with her. He angled the head to where they were pointed upward facing his mother's bedroom window. He would later say he did this purposely because his mother always wanted to be looked up to. When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and raped her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. Not as scary as some of the stories here, but I was pretty horrified when my dad told me the story. There are some really big houses in the woods in my hometown. One of the owners went out drinking with his buddies and realized he forgot the key to the gate when he got home. So he decided to just climb the gate. While climbing in his drunken state he slips and his leg gets pierced by one of the spikes on the gate. He was hanging there but too afraid to call for his wife, since he was sure she would just open the automatic gate from inside the house, and since it was one of those gates that slides to the side it would just rip his leg off if she did. He was hanging there the entire night until his wife woke up, saw him and called the fire department. My dad, who is one of the firefighters that showed up, said they had to saw off the spike to get him off. Just imagine hanging from your own gate all night not being able to call for help. I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases where her family didn't pay the husband enough money, so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. People who use acid as a weapon are seriously ducked. People who kill women over dowries are seriously ducked. 100% true as it happened to me. It's probably more spooky than scary. I'll let you be the judge. Many years ago, before there were cell phones, we had these things called pagers strapped to our hips. Someone would page you with their phone number and you would call them back when you got to a phone. As an on-call technician working in the audio-visual field, my pager would go off all the freaking time. Like most people who used pagers, our clients knew that if you followed up your number with a 911, that would indicate to the technician to stop what they were doing and call right away. although I was always busy I rarely, if ever, got 911s. One afternoon traveling from Orlando to St. Petersburg via Interstate 4, my pager goes off with the number 1 don't recognize, followed by the 911. I find the first exit and pull into a little truck, stop looking place outside of Plant City to use the payphone. This takes maybe 3 minutes tops. I walk in, ask for some change and head to the wall where there are 4 payphones to choose from. I pop my quarter in and dial the number displayed on my trusty pager. It rings and rings and rings and rings. I'm thinking to myself, WTF? Exclamation mark. Question mark. Exclamation mark. Who would page me with a 911 and not answer their phone? It's just about then that I notice another ringing sound in addition to the one in my ear. I pull the handset from my ear and 2 phones over on the wall another payphone is ringing, but with an incoming call. I hang up my handset and the ringing stops on the other phone. I walk a few paces over, pick up the handset, and look at the phone number printed above the buttons, comma. I look at the number on my pager. I look at the number on the phone. I look at the number on my pager again. I look at the phone again. Except for the 911, they are identical. I kinda lose my breath for a second, and then I make my way over to the girl at the counter and ask if she saw anyone use the payphone. She said I was the only person in the store in the last hour. The whole episode probably took 15 minutes. But man, I was freaked out. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and I just wanted out of there. I get about 10 miles down the highway and come upon a scene that looked like a bomb went off. 4-car pileup involving a tractor trailer hauling a load of steel that had come loose. State troopers and paramedics just arriving. I pulled over to the side and helped the best I could, but it was all pretty much over once it began. I have no idea why I got that page, or from whom or what, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't, I would not be alive to write this today. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18, and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came into open one morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night/early morning, raped and left, blacked out in the alley. It was just a ducked up and surreal situation to be involved in. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes. This is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on what are we? Sacramento. In a thread full of stories making me question why I'm even here. Yours has some comical value at least. While I understand it might have been traumatic for you, this part, we stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes. This is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Just makes me laugh so much for some reason. Old janitor from high school. Friendly Ecuadorian man who went vaping. Worked at the school for 20 plus years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him, and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the third rail. We kinda stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead. But then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly and he did. We got him off the tracks and no less than 2 minutes later a train went zipping by. I think the third rail turned on seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me, it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12. That there's a guy casing the bar that I work at literally right now, and I can't do anything to stop him. He's been in asking what time/days we are open and what days we have security. Caught him feeling the corners of our windows and doors too. Unfortunately, until he breaks in and robs us, the police won't do a thing. A guy I work with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. The case of Elizabeth Smartlink. Wikipedia. org/wiki/kidnapping_of_Elizabeth_smart. She was kidnapped, repeatedly raped, psychologically tortured, and then brought around in plain sight in heavy religious garb. She had brushes with people who could have helped her, but her kidnapper claimed she wasn't allowed to speak in public or reveal her face for religious reasons. The reason she was rescued is because her sister was awake during her kidnapping and pretended to be asleep. She knew she recognized the voice, but it took her 9 months to remember it was a guy that used to do yard work for the family. The police didn't believe her because of the elapsed time, but pursued it to appease the family. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to @ I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. I've posted this before, but mine, when I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team. Out for beers and pizza after with the guys. Family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses. With a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night. But I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to banks/a grocery store, where one dad was manager and clear out accounts/a safe. They then came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day. To edit. Wow, you guys are amazing detectives. I have been telling this story for years, and this is the first time I have been made aware that it wasn't me as a baby. It was my sister, 9 years older, born in 72. My dad has been telling me this story wrong for as long as I can remember. Sorry for the confusion. All Carol Daronch was at a shopping mall in Salt Lake City in 1974 when she was approached by a man claiming to be a police officer. He said that someone had tried to break into her car and asked her to come with him. He then said he would drive her to the police station, and she got into his car. However, this guy was not a police officer and he did not drive her to the police station but rather pulled into a parking lot. He then cuffed her, pulled out a gun, and threatened to kill her if she resisted. Only, he messed up. He meant to cuff both of her wrists, but only managed to cuff one. She escaped and fought him off despite being hit over the head several times. Her kidnapper was Ted Bundy. He killed another woman just 4 hours later. Her escape also helped identify Bundy, and she is part of the reason he was eventually arrested. I used to run the boilers in a dough building. Apparently at some point in the 80s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had apparently been stolen out of this warehouse. It was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found shot to death. And later the bodies of the other 2 were reported buried in Monticello but Wordies. They had first been incinerated. In the boilers I was in charge of operating and maintaining. There were 3 operational boilers, and one that wasn't in service. No clue which one was supposedly used. But when you're firing them up, you're typically the only person in the building. Not a single day went by that I fired them up and didn't wonder which one was used. But that wasn't what gave me the real heebie-jeebies. You have to clean the interior of these boilers really well. Otherwise the fire won't transfer heat to the water very efficiently, especially with ash 6 oil. These boilers would build up a lot of soot. You have to suit up in a Tyvek suit, wear a mask, and climb right into the firebox. I found myself staring down the business end of that burner many times, wondering what that panic would feel like. I'm reasonably sure these people were dead before getting put in the boiler though. Close bracket. Once, I was actually in one boiler while another one was running. The valve that isolated my boiler from the main steam line wasn't holding, and by the time I realized how warm it was getting, it was enough to panic trying to lift myself up and belly crawl through the small opening. The metal was almost too hot to keep my hands on for long. Definitely creepy experience, considering the history of that boiler room. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked, and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800-900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Edit. Whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments/questions. Sorry if I end up missing yours. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Told this here before, but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e. without lights/sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact and the only reason the 3rd survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. That's terrifying. I missed a situation like this years ago. Was hanging out with a buddy at the bars and we leave to go back to his place for some smoke and video games. His roommate comes home from work. He was a bartender and tells us he's heading out to the bars and asks if we want to go. He'll drive. We go back and forth but eventually decide to stay in. Turns out, the buddy had been drinking heavily at work, but we couldn't tell. He ended up flipping his Jeep off of an overpass and dropping 20+ feet. The entire back of his Jeep, where I would have been sitting, was crushed into the back of the front seat. The roll bar was smashed into the passenger side. Buddy ended up getting some serious brain injuries and spent the next few years learning how to walk and talk again. He's still pretty off and much different than he used to be. My other buddy and I came very close to a similar or worse fate. This may just horrify me more than others. Link. Daily News. com/news/national/man found cooked death tuna factory article 1,182,607 link. Daily News. com/news/national/man found cooked death tuna factory article 1,182,607. Dude was working on a tuna steamer and they closed him in and steamed him. I can't help but imagine that as anything but a truly terrifying and painful way to die. One of the main reasons I never could bring myself to do real factory labor is because I don't trust people enough to not tuna steam me. Edit. Thanks for the gold. RIP Joe Smilina. It's insane how little I see maintenance using proper lockout tagout procedure. A few months ago a guy in maintenance was putting in new poles to mark where forklifts couldn't go since some guys were driving them way too close to the offices for whatever reason. Apparently one of the welders on our shop truck wasn't grounded properly, so when someone would weld the entire ducking cart was hot. Now up until this point the perfect circumstance to complete the circuit to cause electrocution hadn't been met. Well, that ended that day. He was welding a plate to the pole and managed to be touching the cart and TH pole at the same time and was being electrocuted with I believe 480 plus volts. Luckily another mechanic was there and kicked him out of the loop and saved his life. This cart has been unsafe like that for years and nobody knew until that guy found out the hard way a few months ago. I have way too many stories like this from my years in production facilities. How the last company I worked for is still up and running I have no ducking clue. They bought their way out of a lot of trouble, I know that. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. Semicolon. Edit. The guy's name was Terry Driver. Here's a link to his wiki link. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Terry_Driver. My family has a similar story and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal, because their story is pretty unique. When my parents were in college they went on a trip down to Florida. They had met through mutual friends and were down there together, but hadn't gone on a date yet. My dad and one of his friends were planning to meet my mom and some of her friends at a hotel, but being the carefree college guys they were, they lost track of time and realized it was impossible to get to the hotel on time by walking. They decided the best solution to their problem was to hitchhike, and a car with 2 women picked him up. Everything seemed fine until the driver asked them if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend agreed it was no problem since they were making good time, and she drove into a gas station. She then pumped her car full of gas before hopping back in and flooring it, basically stealing the gas with 2 hitchhikers in the back. My dad and his friend were beginning to freak out when she pulled a gun from under her seat and asked, "Are we gonna have a problem or something?" Like that. My dad and his friend shook their heads vehemently, because what else do you do in that situation? She then drove them to the hotel and dropped them off without so much as a scratch, and they kinda thought nothing of it until the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida known as Aileen Wuornos. He took one look at her picture and instantly recognized her as the driver. The only reason my dad thinks she didn't straight up kill them was because they were super polite and respectful to her and her victims. We're usually scumbag guys trying to take advantage of her. TL. Dr. Aileen Wuornos is the reason my dad got to his first date with mom on time. Edit. Spelling. I'll tell you one that happened to me. Or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow and smashed head on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My god, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten methodica driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Low Hutton Channel 12 News. Happened to me. Have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried, cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet, she was 5 feet 3, and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police/EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. In 3rd grade, a guy came to our school and held our class hostage. He had already killed his wife and was there to kill his kid. The administrators convinced him the kid was not there and to take one of their cars and leave, after threatening to kill us multiple times, tying up the gym teacher, and dragging someone's grandma around with a knife at her neck. He finally left about 30 minutes later. The police caught him in Indiana on his way to kill his parents. He was convinced the world was ending, and he was killing everyone he loved to spare them. The school did worse than nothing. They lied to parents, and no assistance was given to either the kids or teachers involved. The gym teacher never came back, and every time she would see one of the kids at the store or whatever, she had a breakdown. Several of us have PTSD, undiagnosed, for decades. We just thought it was normal. In the 70s, the Chicago public school system was more concerned about their jobs and lawsuits, so they covered it up. My long-term partner decided to end his life suddenly and unexpectedly a few years ago. He was the happiest person I knew, and even with 20/20 hindsight videos pouring through old messages etc, I wouldn't be able to identify any warning signs. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Nigleria fowleri link. Wikipedia org/wiki/Nigleria_fowleri. The brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Link. CNN. facebook.com/2007/health/10/04/amaba lake/index html for those interested. Well, this one was quite dreadful for me, at least. Whilst I was working back in 2006, I was working inside of a multi-story car park. I came down in the lift from the top floor, where I was working at the time. As I got out the lift, there was a woman in her late 40s, I would say, with graying hair and a maroon handbag. We brushed shoulders as I got out the lift. I apologized. She gave me a very blank look. I walked out to go get some food, not thinking at the time much more than that. Although, when I think about it, the lady appeared to look quite sad. I returned with my noodles around 20 to 30 minutes later. At this point I got back, and police were everywhere. The lady had jumped from the top floor. I knew it was her from the handbag laying on the floor. Gosh, if I had stopped and spoke to her, or left for lunch a little later, I may have been able to stop her jumping. Alright. So my preschool teacher, who also ended up somehow changing jobs and becoming my 11th grade English teacher, had a super interesting life. Her mother had some super famous book. Her father worked high up in the government. But enough about her family. First, let me describe her to you. She had dark hair and blue eyes. You'll see why this matters in a minute. She told this story every single year to the new students in her class. When she was younger, she was driving through Arizona on a two-way road, while her boyfriend at the time was following behind her on his motorcycle. For those who don't live in Arizona, certain stretches of it can be quite isolated and deserted. She said that they were on a long drive. It's been about 6 years since I was in her class, so details are fuzzy. But basically her and her boyfriend both knew the destination where they were heading by memory, and eventually got separated by a few miles. A man who was behind her in a Volkswagen Beetle kept pulling up beside her into the other lane. No one was coming, and motioning at her to pull over. He somewhat ignored him the first few times, but he kept doing it and began getting more frantic each time. She said that she believed that he spotted something wrong with her car, so she saw a parking lot off the road for a deserted gas station and pulled over. Once pulled over, she said that she instantly got an eerie feeling. The man was suspicious and kept telling her that he saw something wrong with her headlight, and insisted she get out of the car so he could show her what he meant. Her boyfriend, who was a few miles behind her, eventually caught up and spotted her car at the sketchy gas station. Right as she was out of the car, her boyfriend began to pull in. As he did that, this man got into his car and sped off like his life depended on it. They later were able to identify that the man was Ted Bundy. She said she cannot imagine what would have happened to her if her boyfriend had been even another 3 miles behind her on the road. Edit. Spelling/clarity of details. Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical type businesses, egg care homes etc., and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling etc. needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying/pressing when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called in. The laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cart waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized, just on shift, was the best guess, so just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper/trolley thing. The other nurses/parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in to stop anything like that Happening again. Edit. Just found it in the newspaper. Turns out I misremembered the how of getting into the laundry basket slightly wrong. Link. Daily Mail. Co. UK/news/article 97455/dead baby thrown hospital laundry. HTML. I had to dig through my hospital's biohazard trash because a nurse had thrown out a fetus. Probably the worst day of work I've ever had. Edit. Yikes, this blew up. I'm trying to get to all the questions, but I'm at work. I'll try to catch up. Have you heard of the Nazi so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Exclamation mark. Well, his name was Oscar de la Hoya, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the de la Hoya Brigade. Oscar de la Hoya was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oscar's old pal Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails/camps and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or, in most cases, civilians in occupied countries. Oscar de la Hoya SS unit was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising, they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay, once the church was secured, they raped the female staff and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived, they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully, by the end of the war, this unit was destroyed and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals. Tough to pick just one, because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful. But in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him upside down against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help, but couldn't hear the dispatcher. ISAC said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. This is not a joke. The teen said over 911. I'm almost dead. Apostrophe. He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I'll love her if I die. Apostrophe. Link. com/teen who suffocated in van tell my mom I love her /3,336,194/ Just a horrible, random accident that could have happened to anybody. This kid didn't go looking for trouble. Like he didn't try and go down a chimney or go caving like other people who have gotten stuck and suffocated. He was just reaching for something in his trunk, got pinned, and then was not found in time. Nightmarish for the kid and his family. One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night, and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union spearheaded a campaign to convince the World Health Organization that smallpox could be eradicated. Smallpox is a highly contagious disease that is specific to humans. Insofar as we know, no other species on Earth can get or carry smallpox. In 1977, the last case of smallpox was identified and snuffed out. The disease was eradicated. However, rather than destroy the final genetic samples of the disease, the Cold War superpowers decided to store it. Some went to the Soviet Union and some went to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. The Soviets began a weaponization program. This means that they tried to make a stronger, more contagious, more lethal strain of smallpox. They tried to cross it with other diseases like Ebola, creating entirely artificial chimera diseases. They grew smallpox in the lab by the ton and kept it loaded, ready to be fired on missiles into the United States. But it's not a missile that's frightening. A single glass ampoule of the stuff smashed against the wall of a subway station in New York or Chicago or Tokyo could spark a global outbreak. Very few people alive today have been vaccinated for smallpox, and there are but a scant few doses of vaccine available. In the event of an outbreak, our ability to manufacture vaccine would be rapidly outpaced. If the wrong person got their hands on the Soviet smallpox bioweapon, billions could die. Nuclear weapons are bad enough, but they, at least, require a general war to break out in order to bring about an end to human civilization. A smallpox bioweapon doesn't require a war, just one security breach. During WWII, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Chichijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. 1 was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The one serviceman who was rescued, that was George H. W. Bush. Google Chichijima incident for more details if you'd like. The Battle of Osawik Fortress, 1915. German troops attempted to gas the Russian defenders out as the fort had been a thorn in the side of the Germans since the outbreak of war. The gas succeeded in killing almost 3 whole companies. The Germans then advanced across the fields, expecting the fortress to be empty and an easy victory. From within the fortress, Russian troops emerged, coughing up blood and lung fragments, covered in bandages made up as improvised gas masks as well as chemical burns. They returned rifle and light artillery fire at the advancing Germans. The German troops didn't bother firing back as they just ran back to their lines. Their commanders claimed they are already dead. Give it 20 minutes and go take the place, to which the soldiers remarked, it is not men protecting that place, but the devil. Osawik Fortress never fell during the war, as when the German troops went back months after there was already fresh defenders. I know this story is much different to the ones other people have said, but it's the one I could think of as truly terrifying. My mom didn't tell me this story for the longest time. I think just so she wouldn't unnecessarily worry me when I was younger. But my parents split up when I was about 4 years old, and my mom and my sisters stayed in a small townhouse for a few years before moving in with my stepdad. Anyway, while we were at the townhouse for I think less than a year, my mom heard something in her room in the middle of the night, and when she woke up to go look, there was a man in her room. She audibly gasped and got out of bed either to fight or run to our room. She couldn't really decide cause she was pumped full of adrenaline. The guy ended up running out of our back door, and when the police came they found signs of forced entry. She never told any of us the full story cause we were still sound asleep the entire time, but she ended up explaining more of it the older we got. Edit. Sorry for not explaining more. A lot of people have asked me to finish the story, so here goes. We never found out who it was. The police weren't able to either. Their best guess was that he broke in to rob the place. God forbid he wanted to do anything else, and was just as surprised to see my mom as she was to see him. They think that he thought the place was empty and it would be an easy mark, and bailed when he came face to face with the owner. A bunch of girls in my friend group decided to have a night out and ended up at the local gay club. I can't remember why I didn't go, but I'm sort of glad I wasn't there. However, I also wish I had been, so I cold helped. Anyway, they noticed a girl on the dance floor who looked super out of place. She had sweat pants and a t-shirt on and wasn't wearing makeup, and had her hair in a ponytail. She also had a backpack on. Basically, the exact opposite of typical club attire, and not at all what someone would usually wear to this place. They said that she seemed very dazed as well. And more importantly, there was a very large man grabbing her and grinding on her, and she was just kind of standing there letting it happen. One of my friends tried approaching her to ask if she was alright, but the guy spoke for her and insisted that he was her boyfriend and that she'd just had too much to drink, but that she was okay. Everyone was suspicious, but at that point there wasn't much else they could do, so they just kept an eye on the two of them. Eventually the guy left the dance floor to go to the bar, and my friend was able to talk to this girl again. She said that she was extremely out of it, and that it seemed more likely that she had been drugged rather than just drunk. The girl managed to convey that she didn't know the man she was with and wanted to leave. So my friend grabbed her and made for the exit. But not before this guy came back. He immediately flipped out, got right in my friend's face, and started screaming at her. It escalated to the point that he eventually swung at my friend, who just barely dodged the punch. Thankfully, someone else had went and found a security guard, and they were able to prevent this guy from hurting anyone, meaning that my friends and the girl were all able to leave safely. She was still super messed up when they left, so nobody could get the full story out of her, but she did say that the guy had been following her around town all day. The really scary part is that the bar staff couldn't technically do anything other than throw this guy out after my friends had left. One of them called the cops and gave them a description of the guy, but they said they couldn't really do much other than be on the lookout for him. So chances are that he's still out there somewhere and may do this again. A family friend was cleaning her bus before the bus run. She had two small kids who were strapped into car seats in the bus. She swept the floor and was standing outside the bus leaning in, using a dustbin and brush to collect the dirt she had swept up. The auto doors on the bus kicked in and closed on her neck. She suffocated while her two young children looked on, unable to do anything because they couldn't undo their car seat buckles. I wonder what kind of bus this was. Every bus I can think of, the doors move pretty easily with force. Please click subscribe if you enjoyed this video.